It all started with a glance. They were gathered around the table, laughter and shouts filling the air, the scent of grilled meat wafting through the backyard of a suburban home in New Jersey. He turned his head, and there she was, his best friend's wife, looking straight at him as if she could see right through him, reading every thought that flickered in his mind. Then, just like that, she smiled, a knowing smile that sent a jolt through him. That was the moment his descent began. What was he supposed to do? Run away? Stop visiting his best friend, Mark, or confront her directly and say, "Don't look at me like that"? Easy to say, but much harder to do when her hand rested on his shoulder, and she whispered something in his ear while the others were busy slicing up the barbecue in the kitchen. Life has a way of being treacherous. You can tell yourself 100 times, "I'm strong, I'm moral." But when you're caught off guard by tenderness and that warm breath so close to you, it's a different story. He wasn't a warrior, he was just an ordinary guy. And this was a story about how one woman made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. He couldn't deny that he was drawn to her. Their friendship had blossomed from the typical drunken revelry that often accompanies the birth of a child. His son had just been born, and it was time for the baptism. Naturally, he invited Mark, his best friend from high school, the one who had been by his side through thick and thin, even in the army. Everything felt right, everything was by the book. And then there was Lisa, Mark's wife. Where would they be without her? No one anticipated what would come of it. He remembered the first time they all gathered together as this new family. They sat around a table overflowing with food, everyone's faces lit up with joy. Mark was already red-faced, shouting toasts like bullets from a gun. But his gaze kept drifting to Lisa, and something inside him stirred uncomfortably. She wasn't the kind of woman you'd instantly label as a goddess. No, she was simple yet strikingly captivating. A perfect blend of sass and warmth, and her ability to command a room was undeniable. Unlike his own wife, who was always modest and looking down at her plate, Lisa was animated. She joked, laughed, and could even tease him in a way that made everyone else chuckle. If a song played, she'd get up and dance, full of life. He thought to himself, Mark is lucky, but then again, maybe not, because a woman with character is both a blessing and a curse. From that day on, their paths crossed more frequently, holidays, birthdays, barbecues, and sometimes just casual visits for coffee. Each time, he noted how she never let things get dull. Wherever Lisa was, there was energy. She could tell a joke that made everyone's ears turn red or lean in and whisper something to him that felt innocent but carried a weight beyond mere laughter. Deep down, he sensed she was fully aware of the effect she had on him. He was just a man, after all. Sitting there, listening, he could feel an electric tension building inside him. The interesting part was that she never crossed any lines. Not once did she make an overt advance or have a blunt conversation. Everything was subtle, hinted at, cloaked in innuendo. There was one moment that stuck with him, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. They were all at Mark and Lisa's cabin for a weekend getaway. The men were grilling outside while the women prepared salads in the kitchen. He stood by the grill, flipping burgers, when Mark stepped out to grab more charcoal. Lisa appeared, carrying a plate, and as she set it down beside him, she leaned in just a little too close. Her hair brushed against his arm, and he froze like a deer in headlights. She lingered for a moment longer than necessary, looking at him with a smile that seemed to say more than words ever could. Then she walked away as if nothing had happened, but his mind was racing. That night, lying next to his wife, he could still feel the ghost of her hair on his skin. It was a small thing, really, but it had lodged itself in his brain. And it kept happening. Each time they met, there was something, her knee brushing against his under the table, a playful hug that lasted a second too long. It seemed innocuous, but when pieced together, it was anything but coincidence. He found himself anticipating their encounters, his mood shifting when he knew he would see her. It was a dangerous realization, for once you reach that point, you're no longer free, you're ensnared. The most insidious part was how she could be different with him. With Mark, she was sharp, witty, and could hold her own in a debate. But with him, she was softer. She listened, laughed at his jokes, even the dumb ones, and looked at him as if he mattered. And that made him compare. His wife was kind but perpetually tired, their life together predictable and calm. Lisa, on the other hand, was a spark, vibrant, unpredictable, and alive. A treacherous thought began to swirl in his mind: what if I'm not living the right life? He tried to push her away, to resist, but the more he fought it, the more he craved it. The forbidden fruit was always sweeter. Lisa smiled, and it felt as if she knew he was slowly giving in. To be fair, Mark was a good guy. Mark had always been the kind of friend you could count on. They had been through thick and thin together, sharing countless stories over beers and enduring the ups and downs of life side by side. But as a husband, he fell short of expectations. He was the type who preferred a simple life: work, home, a cold beer, and the couch. It wasn't that he was just tired, it felt as if he had become indifferent to his wife, Sarah. He would sit glued to his phone, barely glancing up to ask what was for dinner or where his socks were. Meanwhile, Sarah, with her fiery spirit and vibrant personality, craved attention, conversation, and connection. Instead, she was met with silence and a beer can. As Mark observed this dynamic, he couldn't help but notice how Sarah seemed to be fading. She would sit next to him, but her eyes were vacant, reflecting a longing for something more. It was a painful realization because women often need more than flowers, they need genuine attention. When that attention is absent, they begin to seek it elsewhere. And that's where things started to shift, right under his nose. At first, Mark tried to convince himself that he was imagining things. She's just a lively person, he would tell himself. But eventually, it became clear, Sarah was looking for something in him that she wasn't getting from her husband. Mark, oblivious to the growing distance, would host gatherings, drink too much, and pass out wherever he landed. Meanwhile, Sarah and Mark's friend, Jake, would find themselves sitting together, laughing, their eyes sparkling with shared jokes and unspoken connections. It was a troubling thought that began to creep into Jake's mind: what if I'm better for her than he is? He found himself catching moments where he was more attentive, more engaged, and more fun than Mark had been in a long time. But with that realization came a wave of guilt. It felt like a betrayal, a stab in the back to a friend who had stood by him through everything. How could I even think that? He wrestled with himself. I'm a friend, a husband, I have a family. I can't cross that line. But then, the other side of him whispered, but she's alive, she's reaching out to you. Don't you deserve happiness too? Every time they met, the internal struggle intensified. Mark would be off in the corner, lost in his drink and the game on TV, while Sarah would take Jake's hand, seemingly by accident, but lingering just a moment too long. When she looked at him, her eyes spoke volumes, and Jake felt a rush of emotions that terrified him. It was worse than any kiss could have been. He understood the implications of those glances and touches. He was scared of where this was heading, knowing that betraying Mark would feel like cutting off a part of himself. Yet, he also felt trapped, knowing that Mark had let her slip away without even noticing. The most agonizing part was that nothing had actually happened yet. The tension was electric, and every shared glance or touch sent shivers down his spine, making it impossible to sleep at night. This was the real torture. The first serious warning bell rang during one of their gatherings. They were all seated around a long table, filled with salads, appetizers, and plates of food. Beneath the table, empty bottles piled up, a testament to their revelry. Mark, as usual, had passed out first, his face flushed and swaying slightly in his chair, while the rest of them continued to enjoy the evening. Then Sarah sat down next to Jake. At first, it seemed innocent enough, but the distance between them was non-existent. Her knee brushed against his, and he thought, it's just a tight squeeze at the table. But then he realized she wasn't moving away, she was leaning in, smiling, and engaging him in conversation as if nothing was amiss. Inside, Jake felt a spark ignite. He tried to act normal, but his pulse raced, and he could feel the blood pounding in his ears. Then she leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "You're probably the only normal one here." That whisper sent chills down his spine. Her breath was soft, and her hair brushed against his neck, making him shiver. He nearly dropped his drink. This wasn't just friendly banter, it was a hint, a suggestion that could be interpreted in many ways, but he knew it wasn't accidental. After that moment, he found himself dreading future gatherings. He knew that if they ended up next to each other again, it would be game over. And, of course, they always ended up together, as if drawn by some magnetic force. There was another occasion when their group went to a lake for a day of grilling and fun. The kids were running around, laughter filling the air. Mark, as usual, was content with his beer, barely participating in the festivities. Sarah, however, decided to go for a swim and called out to Jake, "What are you waiting for? Come join me." He felt he couldn't refuse. As they waded into the water, she splashed playfully, her laughter ringing out like music. The sun glinted off the water, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that every laugh, every touch, was pulling him deeper into a situation he was desperately trying to avoid. The thrill of being close to her was intoxicating, yet it was laced with guilt and fear. He was caught in a web of emotions, knowing that the line between friendship and something more was blurring with every passing moment. Jake stood by the grill, flipping burgers while the laughter of children echoed around the backyard. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the gathering. He tried to focus on the sizzling meat, but his mind kept drifting to Sarah, who was playfully splashing water at her friends by the pool. Suddenly, she darted closer, her laughter ringing out like music. In a moment of spontaneity, she splashed water directly into his face. Startled, Jake instinctively grabbed her wrist to retaliate, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she stood there, water glistening in her hair, droplets cascading down her shoulders. He held her wrist, feeling an electric charge between them, a moment that stretched infinitely. Just one more second, and he feared he would lose himself completely. But he released her, laughing it off, pretending it was all in good fun. Yet, as he returned to the grill, he felt as if he had been struck by lightning, the thrill of the moment lingering long after. These moments became more frequent. Sarah would adjust his shirt collar, wipe crumbs from his lips, or place her hand on his shoulder when she spoke, always lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Inside, a fierce battle raged. One part of him screamed, "Stop! You're married, you have kids, you have responsibilities." The other whispered, "So what? It's just nice to feel appreciated." He began to notice himself searching for her gaze across the table, his heart racing whenever their eyes met. It was a dangerous game, one that felt like walking a tightrope. She never overtly flirted, but there was an undeniable tension that hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement that something unspoken was brewing between them. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed and his brother-in-law was snoring on the couch, Jake found himself alone with Sarah in the kitchen. They chatted about mundane things, sipping tea, when she suddenly turned serious. "You understand me better than he does," she said, her eyes locking onto his. Time froze. In that instant, everything became clear. This was no mere coincidence, she was genuinely seeking something in him that she couldn't find in her husband. Jake felt a rush of conflicting emotions. He wanted to take her hand, to say, "Yes, I understand," to pull her close and reassure her. But he held back, knowing that if he gave in even a little, there would be no turning back. Yet, the desire was overwhelming, coursing through him like a wildfire. It was then that he truly realized they were playing with fire, and someone was bound to get burned. As the days passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate was conspiring to bring them together. At his sister-in-law's birthday party, the house was filled with guests, music, and the joyful chaos of children running around. His brother-in-law had indulged a bit too much and passed out before the cake was served. As the crowd began to thin, Jake's wife took the kids home, leaving him behind to help clean up. The house was quiet now, the television murmuring in the background. Jake and Sarah stood in the kitchen, washing dishes. It felt ordinary, yet the tension between them was palpable, like a tightly wound string ready to snap. As he moved past her, their hands brushed together. It was a small thing, but in that moment, it felt monumental. Her fingers lingered on his hand, and their eyes met in a fleeting glance that left Jake breathless. "Are you tired?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "You look worn out." "Just a little," he replied, trying to sound casual, but he could see the concern in her eyes. "You have such tired, yet beautiful eyes," she said softly, stepping closer. The distance between them evaporated, and he could feel her warm breath against his skin. In a moment of sheer madness, he stepped back toward the table, but she followed, her hand resting on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, yet it sent shockwaves through him. He could feel the warmth radiating from her touch, and his heart raced uncontrollably. She leaned in slightly, her hair brushing against his cheek, and he could hear her breath so close that it made his insides tighten. In that instant, he wanted nothing more than to forget everything, his wife, his children, the life he had built. All he wanted was to hold her and never let go. But he didn't. Instead, he made a foolish joke, careful, or people might think we're having an affair. She looked at him, her gaze intense, and then smiled, but it was a different smile, one that held more challenge than tenderness. "What if that wouldn't be so bad?" she whispered, her tone casual, as if discussing the weather. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He was momentarily speechless, caught off guard by the weight of her suggestion. She took a step back, grabbed a dish towel, and began wiping the table, as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done, her words echoed in his mind, a persistent reminder that they had crossed a line. That night, Jake returned home late, his mind racing with thoughts of Sarah. As he lay beside his wife, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The line between friendship and something more had blurred, and he knew they were treading dangerous waters. Jake couldn't shake the image of Sarah from his mind. Her eyes, her breath, the warmth of her hand resting on his shoulder, it all replayed in vivid detail. The more he tried to push those thoughts away, the more they returned, relentless and consuming. Since that moment, he had become a different man, more attentive, more eager for their encounters. It was as if she could read him like an open book. The next time they crossed paths, there was no longer a question in her gaze, there was a knowing answer. There's a saying among men, the longer you hold back, the more the pressure builds until something gives way. That's how it felt between him and Sarah. After that evening when she had casually suggested, "What if that wouldn't be so bad?" he realized there was no turning back. He tried to be honest, throwing himself into work, striving to be the perfect husband at home, engaging with his children. But whenever they were together, the world around him faded until it was just her. Their conversations began innocently enough. She would confide in him, "He doesn't really hear me. I talk to him, and he's glued to the TV. It feels like I'm just furniture." Jake would nod, pretending to understand, but inside he thought, "Why are you telling me this? You know where this leads." As time passed, she opened up more, sharing her fears about being merely a wife, expressing how she longed for appreciation. It struck him deeply, she was genuinely unhappy. This wasn't a game or flirtation. She wanted to be loved, and he, foolishly, stepped into that role. He became her shoulder to lean on, listening and supporting her, saying the things her husband should have said. The more he listened, the more he became attached. A woman who shares her soul with you is no longer just a family friend, she becomes someone who invites you into her innermost being. One evening, the weight of their connection became undeniable. They sat on the porch of her home, the children playing in the yard, and her husband already asleep inside. With a cup of tea between them and a candle flickering on the table, she suddenly placed her hand on his. It was a deliberate gesture, not a joke or an accident. "You understand me better than anyone," she said softly. In that moment, Jake felt the gravity of their situation. He could sense her warmth, her breath close to him, and her eyes, oh, how they sparkled. His body instinctively knew what it wanted. He did what he had done for months, he made a joke, saying something silly like, "I just know how to listen." But she didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she tightened her grip, and he thought he could hear her heart racing. Inside him, a war raged. On one side was duty, friendship, family, conscience, all screaming at him to stop, to remember the commitments he had made. On the other side was desire, the closeness, the scent of her, the warmth radiating from her. Everything screamed at him to take the leap now or never. For the first time, he wondered if all their morals were just constructs. Perhaps love and passion could surpass any vow. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They held not just desire but pain, a silent plea that said, "Save me." He realized that if he succumbed now, it would no longer be a game, it would become their reality. He withdrew his hand and said firmly, "You're my best friend's wife." She looked at him, her silence stretching between them, before a small smirk appeared on her face. "Yes, but I haven't felt like a woman in a long time." Her words cut through him like acid, and he understood she was right. She didn't feel cherished by her husband, but with him, she did. In that moment, he fully grasped the precariousness of their situation. They were walking a tightrope, and one misstep could lead to disaster. After that conversation, he returned home, sitting alone in the kitchen, smoking and staring out the window. His wife and children were asleep, and he pondered, what if this isn't just a coincidence? What if she's meant for me? But then the image of his friend flashed in his mind, his laughter, the way he would clap Jake on the shoulder, all the years of friendship they had built together. He realized that if he took that step, he would lose everything, his friend, his family, and himself. If anything, the desire only intensified. Now, it wasn't just hints, there was a shared secret binding them tighter than any words could express. He knew this couldn't last much longer. They had reached a tipping point, and the only question was who would cross that line first. That night, everything came to a head. There were no more maybes or what-ifs. It was just him, her, and the tension that had been building for months. Did it happen at their house? Of course. Where else could it be? It was another celebration, another gathering. Her husband, as usual, was the first to retire. Sarah remained behind to tidy up. The guests had trickled out, some lingering in the kitchen, but soon the house fell silent, leaving just the two of them. Jake tried to leave, already putting on his jacket, saying, "I should head out, it's getting late." "Wait, help me clear the table," she said, her tone not asking but commanding. And he stayed. They began to clean up the dishes, the air thick with unspoken words and lingering glances. As Jake and Sarah carried the plates to the kitchen, the warmth of her presence enveloped him. The scent of her hair and skin was intoxicating, a natural allure that drew him closer. He felt the weight of the moment, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that had been building between them for months. When she bent down to pick up a napkin from the table, their hands brushed against each other, and the air crackled with unspoken desire. They froze, caught in a moment that felt suspended in time. Jake looked into her eyes, and the playful banter they usually shared faded away, replaced by a raw, undeniable hunger. She stepped closer, her breath brushing against his lips, sending his heart racing. The world around them faded, and all he could hear was the pounding of his heart and the rush of blood in his ears. When her hand found its way to his neck, he could feel the tremor in his own hands. "You want this too, don't you?" she whispered, her voice low and inviting. God, he wanted it with every fiber of his being. He could feel her warmth, her fingers, her breath, it was like a drug. He leaned in, their lips almost touching, teetering on the edge of something monumental. Just then, the doorbell rang, shattering the moment like glass. They jumped apart, laughter escaping his lips, nervous and awkward. She pressed her hand to her mouth, as if to hide the evidence of their near kiss. Jake opened the door to find their neighbor, who had come by for a trivial reason. It was a small interruption, but it was enough to pull him back from the brink. When he returned to the living room, Sarah was sitting on the couch, pretending to scroll through her phone. But her breath was still uneven, and her eyes sparkled with a mix of excitement and fear. He sat beside her, and the silence that enveloped them spoke volumes, filled with everything they hadn't said. Eventually, he left her house, his mind racing. He lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, reflecting on the moment they almost crossed a line. Just a second more, and I would have lost control. Just one more heartbeat, and we would have acted on everything we had been feeling. What terrified him the most was that he felt no guilt. Instead, he was consumed by desire, wishing the doorbell had never interrupted them, wishing that moment could have lasted forever. From that night on, everything changed. They were no longer just friends, they were bound by a secret that could ignite at any moment. It was a slow burn, more intense than any betrayal, gnawing at him from the inside. As he walked home, he thought, now it's either the end or a new beginning. There was no middle ground. Life had a way of dividing moments into before and after, and for him, that night was the dividing line. At work, he found himself distracted, thoughts drifting to her hands, her breath, the way she had looked at him with such intensity. At home, he tried to be normal, laughing and playing with his kids, but inside, he was restless. Sarah had changed too, she no longer joked as easily, her glances lingering a moment too long, her smiles carrying a hint of something deeper. Jake's friend, Mark, remained oblivious, content on the couch with a beer and the TV. He had no idea of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. They never spoke of that night again, but every time they were near each other, the air was taut, like a drawn bowstring, ready to snap with just a word or a gesture. The hardest part wasn't that he hadn't acted, it was the uncertainty of whether he had made the right choice. Should he have given in? Was Sarah the woman fate had placed in his path? They could have been happy together, and Mark would have been the one to blame for not recognizing her worth. Or perhaps he had saved himself from disaster. Had he crossed that line, he might have lost everything, his friend, his family, his self-respect. Time passed, and they continued to see each other, still playing their roles as friends, still raising glasses and sharing laughter. No one suspected a thing. Yet sometimes, their eyes would meet, and in those fleeting moments, everything that had almost happened lingered between them. This story has no clear ending, for passion doesn't simply vanish, it hides, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Perhaps one day it would return, or maybe it would remain a secret they carried to their graves. Life is a strange thing, often leading us to believe we are in control when, in reality, it holds the reins. So, when you tell yourself, "I would never do that," remember Jake's story and ask yourself, are you sure? Subscribe to the channel,